Hello, guys. Welcome back to the Cocktail Podcast, where today I'm going to be talking to you about the different types of whiskies you could find around the world, what differentiates them, and what you can expect when you drink them. So let's start by talking about whiskey in general. So whiskey is a alcohol that is distilled from cereal grains, so barley, rye, oat, wheat, corn, um, etc. And then it's more often than not aged in wood barrels. Typically, it's oak, although different type of countries tend to use different type of oak and different type of wood, and there's often some very funky stuff that distillers tend to do with all the type of barrels that they use to age the whiskey. The alcohol is then left in the barrel to mature and like absorb the flavor from the wood over a period of time. The breakdown of the cereal grains that distillers use when doing their whiskey, for example, having 50% corn and having 20% of barley, whatever makes up the distilled product of that whiskey, is often referred to as the mash or the mash bill. So you'll often hear these terms thrown out when people are describing whiskey. The main whiskey producing companies that you'll see on a bar menu are Scottish whiskies, also known as Scotch, Japanese whiskies, American whiskies, and Irish whiskies. Note, there are a lot of other countries that do produce whiskey, not just these four. But these four tend to have their own distinct style and are usually a lot more popular. So you'll see sometimes English whiskey, Canadian whiskey. I think China also produces some whiskey. So these are just the top four that I'll be covering for the moment, just due to their massive popularity. But there's always a chance that I may end up doing a podcast on countries that produce whiskey that's not so well known. So if you want that as a type of episode in the future, then feel free to let me know. So starting off with Scotland, Scottish whiskey has a long history, with the first documented mention of Scotch whiskey being mentioned in 1494. So Scotch whiskey must include malted barley as a cereal grain. They are allowed to use other whole grains as well for flavouring within the mash, but you'll tend to see just malted barley used quite a lot within Scotch whisky. Scotch whisky must also only be aged in oak casks and only be distilled in Scotland. You can't really have a whisky that's distilled in Wales being called Scottish whisky. So now a lot of whiskies will have single malt or blended whiskey on the label. This is just a bit more of general information, but does refer a lot to Scottish whiskies in general. So a single malt whiskey is a whiskey that's been distilled at one distillery using a pot still process and made of a mash of 100% malted barley. So it has to be aged for a minimum of 3 years in Scotch, although you tend to rarely see a single malt Scotch that's only 3 years old, and they tend to age it quite a lot more than that. Distilleries tend to blend multiple of their single malts with different ages together to create a final product that they then bottle and sell to market. This is usually done so that they can achieve a certain type of flavour profile that the master distiller wants. So as opposed to them just distilling this one type of whiskey and then aging it in a barrel for, let's say, 10 years and then bottling it straight away, they will tend to blend together loads of different age ranges of whiskey from multiple different barrels. So if you go into your local alcohol shop and you see a bottle of 10-year-old single malt whiskey on the shelf, how do you know how old the whiskey is if distilleries blend their older and their younger single malts together? Because you could go in and try and buy a 10-year-old whiskey, but then how do you know it's not got 3-year-old whiskey inside of it? So the age statement that's on the label of the bottle will always tell you the youngest aged whiskey that is in that bottle. So you see a 10-year-old, at a minimum, the youngest whiskey that's in there is 10 years old. It could have a 20, 50, 70-year-old. I doubt it, but it could have 70-year-old whiskey inside of it. But you never really know because they never tend to disclose that much. although that would be very interesting and something that I really want to learn. A blended Scotch whisky, however, means, unlike a single malt, it uses whisky from multiple different distilleries. They're all blended together, create a product that gives the best parts of different distilleries' whiskies. So single malt, one distillery, it's just that distillery and no others. Blended can mean it's from multiple. So one of my old bar managers once told me that if you were to describe a whiskey in terms of music, a single malt would be similar to like a piano solo. It's great, it shows you what one instrument can do, it shows you the ins and outs, and you can really appreciate that one instrument. However, a blended whiskey is more akin to like an orchestra, where you have multiple different groups of instruments coming together to deliver a balanced, multifaceted experience. Because you're able to get the best of, I don't know, a really fruity type of whiskey and also a very peated type of whiskey, and you can blend them together to get the best out of those two different distilleries' notes. So, blended whiskey does tend to get a bad rap, as it tends to be cheaper whiskey than single malts. However, you can get some really great blended whiskey. So, by all means, give them a try if you're looking to get into Scotch whiskey, as they're not worth skimping out on, full stop. Now, I was writing the script for this podcast, and I was looking at how I was going to present all this information. I was going to talk about all the different flavour profiles found in Scottish whisky, how the region can dictate what type of Scotch you're going to be drinking, how the specific area is influencing all of the nuances that you have within your glass, explain the processes in the distilling, and why it would make it different for a certain region having this certain taste of whisky, whereas another region not having any of those flavours at all. But I'm just going to save a lot of that information, save me waffling on for half an hour. So I'm going to try and explain it very simply, in a very approachable manner. But if you do want a more detailed process, by all means, feel free to let me know. I'm very happy to go deep into it. Although it will be a very long episode. So you have 6 regions in Scotland known for whisky distilling: Islay, Campbeltown, Speyside, Highland, Lowland, and the Islands. Islay whisky is usually characterised by quite strong peat and smoky flavours within the whisky. People tend to describe peat as quite like a medicinal flavour. And you might go, why the hell would I want my whisky tasting like that? But what you can get is you can get a really nice balance between the peat, the smoke, and the sweetness of the whisky. And so it ends up being quite well balanced, even though you might think, this sounds absolutely disgusting. So common brands such as Laphroaig, Ardbeg, Lagavulin, very popular brands of Islay whisky. You've also got Campbeltown, which currently at the moment of recording, they only have 3 producing distilleries. So it makes for the smallest whisky producing region within Scotland. So it's a bit difficult to pick out quite a distinctive regional style for the area. However, they tend to have more of a lighter peated style of whisky. So they tend to have more soft, savoury background flavours in comparison to Islay, but still have a little bit of common characteristics with it. Speyside whisky tend to have little or no peat, but quite an abundance of lighter, sweet and fruity notes, as well as having a lot of whisky finished in sherry casks. That helps add a little bit more like honeyed raisin, figs, and occasionally some like dark chocolate types of flavours within their whisky. Whereas Highland whisky is quite a big, diverse region in terms of how they kind of make their whisky. So you can get really full, rich, cereal sweet whiskies to pungent whiskies that are very similar to produce to those in Islay, with some light and some fruity whiskey mixed in as well. It's a really strange, diverse range, and you can usually work out by north, east, south, or west what kind of flavour profiles they go for and what you can kind of expect from those type of Highland whiskies. But I'm sure if you like Scottish whisky in general, there will be a Highland whisky that you do like. Lowland whiskies tend to be distilled more, which tends to like result in a lighter floral type spirit that tend to be drank more as in like an aperitif as opposed to a digestive that you would usually do with Scotch. The extra distilling just mellows it out a bit more. So it tends to be very easy drinking, very light, nothing strong, nothing overly offensive in it. But having that whiskey in a highball would work extremely well, for example. And then finally, you have the islands. Now, the islands aren't really defined as a whiskey producing region. However, they tend to have whiskey distilleries that tend to produce a slightly different type of whiskey, which is why I've included it into this list. So you've got islands such as the Isle of Skye. They tend to have a lot more smoke, peat, salinity in them, as well as honey notes. So because these islands are right on the shore, they tend to have a lot more salt within the actual whiskey itself. So these tend to be slightly held back on the peat and on the smoke, so less pungent in flavours than you would find in the Islay. However, they tend to be a real good mix of all those honey, sweet, but like a little bit of salinity added into it, so it's not overly sweet. So Islay whiskies, if you took away the peat and you took away the smoke, they would probably be sweeter than those you would find on the Isle of Skye. Of course, this is a vast generalisation, and you will have certain distilleries that wouldn't work as well with. But for example, you've got Talisker and you've got Jura that are on the Isle of Skye, and they both produce amazing whiskey. So if you don't drink Scotch whiskey but you're looking to get into it, my advice for you would be have a look at the different areas that you can buy whiskey from and try and get a sample or at least try some of each different region so you can realise what necessarily I want and what kind of flavour profile I'm looking for. Because you might try Islay whiskey, really not like any of the peat or any of the smoke in there, and you really want something light and fruity, and something just a little bit smoother to go down, in which you might prefer a Speyside whiskey or something in the Highlands, or I want something that I can drink easy before dinner, but I don't want to have anything after my meal as a digestive, then you go for a Lowland whiskey. So there's a lot of diverse things you can go for just within Scotch whiskey. So have a little play around, see what kind of figures out to your taste. So the thing I find a lot is because people see single malts, they think, yeah, cream of the crop, gonna go for that. But then they realise I don't actually like the flavour of malt. Because single malts are 100% malted barley within their mash, there's no real way to avoid that. Unless you just don't drink single malts. So in which you can drink single grain, or you can drink blended whiskey, because they don't have that set limit that they need to be 100% malted barley. So there is some things to kind of play around with if you're not a massive fan of the malt flavour that's within whiskey. There's always some other things that you can try within a Scotch whiskey. Now, American whiskey has quite a few differences to Scotch whiskey. Namely, as opposed to using typically one type of cereal grain, the definition of American whiskey gives a little bit more freedom to the distiller, in that they're allowed to choose more within what they want within their mash. For example, in order for a whiskey to be considered as bourbon within the US, it needs to contain at least 51% corn in its mash bill and be aged in charred American oak barrels. And then if you simply change the cereal grain so that you have 51% rye and it's aged in the same charred oak barrels, you now have a rye whiskey. So say you're making a bourbon, you can use the last remaining 49% of your mash bill and use other cereal grains such as rye, malted barley, wheat, malted rye, and use them just to flavour up your whiskey. So if you use corn as a dominant kind of cereal grain, it tends to lean towards more sweeter flavours like caramel, butterscotch, and some baking spices, with a lot more like fruity cherry notes that tend to emerge. Whereas rye tends to add more peppery flavours with a touch of smoke and a few more herbal notes. Now, this is nothing in terms of smoke that you would get from an Islay or a Isle of Skye whiskey. It's a slight smokiness. Now, in Scotch whiskey, you tend to see whiskies of 10, 12, 15 years fairly commonly. That tends to be bog standard single malt is about 10 years. Whereas American whiskey, you can have advertising of 3, 4, 8 and 10. So the age range seems to be a lot lower within American whiskies. They're not aged as long. But why is this the case? Why are the Americans advertising that they've got a 3-year-old whiskey when Scotland's got a minimum 10-year-old, say, for example? So in Kentucky, which is where bourbon was created, invented, whichever one you want to kind of use, they have very warm summers and they have very cold winters. And the reason this is important is because when that whiskey sits inside that barrel, as the weather starts to get hotter, the whiskey expands into the wood. And as it starts to get colder, it contracts back out of the wood. So you tend to have whiskey moving in and out of the barrel more often. However, you look in somewhere like Scotland, and it's not particularly the most warm in the summer, but it is cold in the winter. So the weather is more consistent year round. It's not as massive of a difference in comparison to Kentucky. So the whiskey would need to sit in that oak barrel for a lot longer in order to get the same amount of flavour from that oak barrel in comparison to American whiskey. With this said, bourbon is not restricted to being made in Kentucky. Obviously, you have Kentucky straight bourbon, but that has to be made in Kentucky. But otherwise, all American whiskey can kind of be made wherever it wants. So you can have Californian bourbon, Washington bourbon, South Carolina bourbon, and these all have different kind of weather. So that would affect how long the whiskey would need to stay in the barrel. If it's somewhere colder and colder all year round, then it can't really stay in the barrel for 3 years and expect to get the same aging off it as you would for something in Kentucky. So this is something that needs to bear in mind when you're buying whiskey from different areas. So, for example, Whistle Pig American whiskey is distilled in Vermont. So they have 10, 15, I think they've even got a 21-year-old bourbon. Whereas in Kentucky, you can see 4-year-old bourbons going for crazy prices anyway. So yeah, very interesting fact and something that a lot of people don't tend to pick up as much. Another thing that tends to be thrown around a lot, specifically when talking about American whiskey, is phrases like bottled in bond. You often see foolproof, and American whiskey for some reason is mentioned much more at cask strength than any other for some reason. So these all have specific type of definitions to it. So bottled in bond means that the whiskey's been produced by one distiller in one distilling season, and it's been aged for a minimum of 4 years, bottled at 50% or 100 proof. So the reason this was brought in basically was because in the old days, people could just bottle a whiskey and sell it off, and you would have no idea whether it came from that distillery, how old it was. It could be 1 year old, stored in a barrel and just sold off. And there was no really redeeming quality about it. So this Bottled in Bond Act actually came in order to make sure that there was a level of quality within the American whiskey you buy, and that you know you're getting a quality that can't be faked. So yeah, essentially it's aged 4 years. I think it's in a US government warehouse, so it's actually tracked and you can't do anything funny to it. And it comes in at 50% ABV. So see Bottled in Bond, there's no funny business with it, and it's just a standard bourbon as such. It's the standard quality, I would say. That's probably the best way to describe it. If you're buying a Bottled in Bond whiskey, you're buying it because, yeah, I want to try this distillery. I want to try what they're serving, what they're doing, and this is the best way to judge it because it's not fucked about with. Full proof is... Okay, I need to step back for this. So they put a certain percentage of whiskey, for example, 60, 70%. There is a limit on it. I don't know off the top of my head. But they put a certain percentage ABV of whiskey into the barrel before it gets aged. And this, while it's in the barrel, the percentage actually goes up, so it becomes more alcoholic. When they take the whiskey out, in order for it to be foolproof, they'll dilute it down back to the level where it entered the barrel at, if that makes sense. So you have a whiskey that goes in at 60%, let's say it rises up to 70% in the barrel, you take it out and you dilute it back down to 60%, then bottle it. That is a foolproof whiskey. So you see foolproof tend to have higher ABV on it. And then you've got barrel strength, which is also known as cask strength. They're interchangeable. They mean the same thing. But what that means is you have a whiskey that goes in at 60% and it leaves the barrel at 70%. It's not diluted down and it's bottled and it goes straight out. And so you're like, well, why would I buy a whiskey that's 60, 70% when most whiskies are 40% that I buy, around that range? What's the point? So the reason is that the flavour's not diluted down. Yeah, you get a lot more burn from the alcohol, which is expected from drinking a higher ABV product, but it just means there's so much more flavour there. I mean, you tend to get people that put in water into whiskey to open it up, and yeah, that's definitely the case. However, if you're just drinking a pure glass of barrel strength whiskey, that is the finished product. No watering down, no dilutions of flavour, and you can appreciate the full flavour profile of that whiskey. By all means, technically, you could filter it back down to whichever percentage you want, although you would probably get shot by some bourbon enthusiasts, because barrel strength whiskey and cask strength whiskey tend to be, or even foolproof, tend to be a lot more sought after. Which kind of brings me on to my next point. So, when you're looking at buying Scotch whiskey, you can go online, unless it's some super rare Macallan 70-year-old whiskey. Pretty much anything you want, if you have the money, you can buy it, right? Whilst the same is technically true with bourbon regarding their secondary market, it's a lot more difficult to access rare bourbon bottles. And this is mainly because the state controls how bourbon gets allocated to liquor stores around the US. So yeah, in Alabama, they'll have state-run ABC liquor stores. And what they tend to do is all the really rare, expensive whiskies, the state will release a list on where they're dropping the alcohol and when. So, for example, bottles of Weller Antique 107, 2 cases of it are dropping at this location, at a minimum. It really depends on the liquor store, how they do it. Like, you can get liquor stores that, when they get their allocated stuff in that the state decides to give them, they'll put it up on the shelf, and then whoever finds it can buy it. You'll get lotteries where the more you spend at a store, you'll end up getting tokens for, and that gives you more chance to win at being able to buy one of these bottles. Yeah, it's a very interesting system, and I don't know why the state controls it that much, but essentially this means that a lot of rare and often sought after bourbon is very difficult to find. And if you do find it, it's usually on a secondary market where the price is 2-3 times what you would expect to pay for it normally. And so there's often videos of people online that are waiting out overnight just for a spot to go and stand in a queue to buy the specific bottle of whiskey at a slight markup, which I just find absolutely crazy. So if you're in an unlucky situation like me, and you live within the UK, and you want to get some bourbon, all the rare and hard to find stuff is really difficult for me to get. Because if it's difficult to get in America, then it's going to be even harder for me to get within the UK unless I pay extortionate amounts for it. And the difficulty is that with different states, they all do it differently. And usually the bigger the liquor store and the more whiskey you sell, the more allocated stuff you get. However, if you're a new liquor store starting up, you're not going to get any allocated whiskey until you start getting up those whiskey sales. So, very type of cutthroat thing that's dealt with America with bourbon. Essentially, stop me rambling, expensive bourbon, hard to find. And that's the reason. State controls it. And there's loads of different systems and how they give out their bourbon. And another thing that gets confused is the difference between bourbon and Tennessee whiskey. So, Typical Tennessee whiskey is Jack Daniels, but the main difference, right, between Tennessee whiskey and bourbon is that Tennessee whiskey is charcoal filtered before it becomes aged. Now, all this charcoal filtering really does is it results in a more mellow flavoured spirits because it removes some of those impurities. And except from the fact that it has to be produced within Tennessee, that's essentially it. Sometimes the whiskey is charcoal filtered more than once to give it more of a smooth flavour, but essentially it's bourbon that's charcoal filtered. So, useful thing to know. So, moving on from bourbon, or American whiskey even, to Irish whiskey, it tends to be thought that it's quite similar to Scotch, considering they're fairly close to each other, although it does have quite a big difference in flavour profiles. And this mainly results to the fact that there's quite a difference in its distillation process and the grains that they used. So Irish whiskey tends to use unmalted barley, although it can use a variety of other cereal grains similar to bourbon. It's also distilled 3 times, in comparison to Scotch whiskey only being distilled twice. There are examples where Scotch whiskey is distilled more than twice, but on average, twice. So this tends to lead to a much more smoother flavoured whiskey. And the unmalted barley tends to give much more like light orchard fruit notes. So you tend to get a lot more apples, pears, occasionally even peaches on Irish whiskey. And with the smoothness, it means that it's just a very easy drinking whiskey. And a lot of the ex-bourbon barrels that were used in the US, where they no longer have use for them because they have to be new and they have to be charred, they sell them to Ireland and Scotland. And so the Irish usually uses ex-bourbon casks to give more of those like slightly sweeter notes, like the vanilla and the honey that ends up coming through on it. And a lot of Irish whiskey is blended. However, you can still actually find some single malts in Irish whiskey if you did want to give them a try. And there's also a couple of Irish distilleries that still use the old traditional methods, which are much more similar to Scottish whiskey. So, for example, there's peated Irish whiskies, which I haven't had the chance to try, but I'm really excited to try, where they still use the peat for drying the barley. And so that's why you get the peaty and the smoky flavours usually hand in hand, because they smoke the peat, in order to dry the barley, which is why you tend to get those flavours going together. So if you're an Islay whiskey fan, give a peated Irish whiskey a try, because if you manage to get it before me, I am very excited to see how similar they are and how different they are. Now, moving on, last region on the list is Japanese whiskey, which is kind of more recently just come to the forefront, and it's only really in the last 20 years started to get more popular. So Japanese whiskey only started being produced in the 1900s. This was because a man who came from I'm not going to bother trying to pronounce his name because I'm horrendous at pronunciations, but he went over to Scotland to study organic chemistry and went around to various whiskey distilleries, and I think his family was in the sake distilling business. So he came back over to Japan and started setting up whiskey distilleries based off what he learned in Scotland. Now, what's really interesting with Japanese whiskey is they built it off the process of they wanted it to be used drinking in a highball. So highball being you put some whiskey in and you put soda or water or something else within it, not just pure whiskey itself. Basically like a mixer, right? Although I have a feeling if you put Coke in a Japanese whiskey in Japan, you would get frowned upon. So they built it off that. So it's not meant to be something that's meant to be drank neat or on ice, like Scotch whiskey is really. So what's interesting with it is in the Scottish section, I mentioned how multiple distilleries can often sell off barrels and they can make blended whiskey. And there is the blended whiskey made in Japan, but it's not from multiple distilleries. They haven't got that infrastructure yet of multiple distilleries swapping barrels around essentially to make a product. So you may see one distillery or one brand have multiple different distilleries in different regions of Japan so that they can produce different types of whiskey, which they can then blend together and sell out. So it's still one distillery producing it, but it's a blended whiskey. They also produce single malts as well. So yeah, very, very interesting type of whiskey. But yeah, like I said, only recently, the last 20 years, have they started becoming more and more popular. And this was mainly due to, I think it was the Nika brand whiskey that won an award in 2001 for Best of the Best. I think it was an international whiskey competition. And so loads of people started thinking, wait, the Japanese actually produce good whiskey. And from there, they've started exporting massively because it was mainly just used internally within Japan. But because there's not really much of peat growing in Japan, they tend to use a very similar process to Scotland. It tends to be a lot more smoother, easy drinking whiskey. It's nothing particularly offensive that comes through on the Japanese whiskey front. And this makes it brilliant because nothing offensive, but they've still got some of those like quite characteristic whiskey flavors within it. Means it's really good for using in cocktails and for putting in highballs. So there you have it. You have the four main countries that are responsible for forming very different types of whiskey, as you probably learned throughout this podcast. So you have Scottish whiskey, single malts, and blended, tend to be malted barley. American, bourbon, rye, Tennessee whiskey, much more freedom, tend to have more sweeter flavours on it. Irish whiskey tend to be a lot lighter, tend to be slightly sweeter with slightly more fruity notes on it. And Japanese whiskey, which is smooth, made for drinking within cocktails and within highballs. So there's your brief little summary into whiskey and the main distilling regions within the world. So I'm going to do a lot of these beginner introductions to various different types of alcohol, just so there's a lot more information going about and people know what they're drinking and they can know what they're like and find good alcohol that suits their tastes. If there's anyone in particular that you really want me to do, then feel free to send me a message on my Instagram at the Cocktail Podcast, and I'll write one up to do it. I've got a couple episodes lined up to do in the next couple of days, so keep your eyes out for those. But have a lovely rest of your day, and cheers for tuning into the Cocktail Podcast.